and welcome to Get Out the Bet, the show with all you need to know about betting on politics. Now, of course, as a reminder, betting on politics is not allowed in the United States, but that doesn't mean we can't talk about it. And since some people are betting on politics in other countries where it's legal, they're putting their money where their mouth is. And it's important to take a look at exactly what they think is going to happen with the U.S. midterm elections. With me, as always, are our two Get Out the Bet betting experts, Paul Krishnamurty and Patrick Everson. Now, today we're going to talk. Oh, I'm sorry, Everson.
Person. It's all right. We're good. We're all getting used to this, Melissa.
It's early. Okay, so today we're going to talk about market movers in the Senate. That is betting odds that have changed since last week and how odds are set in those kinds of races. Then we're going to talk about whether foreign policy is on the minds of voters. And last, we're going to get to some governor's races and compare betting lines to polling information so far. And so let's get started. First up are the market movers. Paul, what are you seeing?
Okay, so I've got 6 races that have moved quite significantly. In 4 of them, let's go through them all. So in Arizona, the Democrats have fallen from 73% likely to 68% likely. These are all on Betfair, by the way. In Georgia, in the wake of the Herschel Walker scandal, as we discussed last week, the Democrats have risen there to 63% from 60%. In Florida, Marco Rubio looks even more certain to win than he did already. He's up to 87% from 84%. In Nevada, the Republican advantage has fallen slightly from 66% to 63%. Critical race, as we discussed, in determining the Senate. In Ohio, where we had the first debate this week, the Republicans have risen from 71 to 77%. And they're also an even stronger favourite in Wisconsin, where Ron Johnson has risen to 78% from 70%. And that's really interesting because that was 50-50 not long ago.
Yeah, what do you think's happened there in Wisconsin to move it so far just in the last week?
I think there's a general realisation that Mandela Barnes just isn't the right candidate for Wisconsin. I think that there was an initial surge of optimism from how well he did in the primaries with the Democrat base. But I think probably it's becoming clearer that that kind of socialist candidate is just the wrong candidate to have in a state like Wisconsin that is primarily rural counties. And they've got a much better chance of winning the governorship there where they've got a more moderate candidate.
Well, also, we learned this past week, I think, that the Republican candidate raised some $20 million, which may, I think we had campaign reporting come out, and that may have helped to bump the odds a little more, even further, into the GOP's favor. What about you, Patrick? Do you see anything that you think is interesting among these?
Well, and it's awesome the way Paul can track this, and I love getting the Betfair numbers too. I just think that's such a neat market where you've, Paul, if I've got it correctly, and relaying to our listeners that may not be listeners and viewers may not be familiar with Betfair. That's literal. I mean, that's like a peer-to-peer betting, right? In a sense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
It's just a neat market. It would be something interesting to have more of. Here in the United States, no question. I thought it was interesting, Melissa and Paul, in looking at Predicted. As we noted last week, Predicted apparently only has a few more months to go, but at least it gets to survive the midterms for a couple of months, which is, as Paul noted last week, that's unfortunate. I think Predicted is it's a fantastic site, a great model, and as Paul noted, a lot of smart people over there, and it would be nice if somehow that would, if that decision could be overturned. But I thought it was interesting that Predicted it's got the 3 key states, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Nevada, going Democrat. And they're all reasonably close too, but 2 of those 3 are trading at better than 60 cents in the Democrats' favor. And I think that's, I'm double checking now, and that would be Georgia and Nevada, with Pennsylvania.
Which is interesting because Nevada is showing, it's down a little bit, but it's still 63% for GOP,
right?
According to Betfair, but Predicted is showing a Democrat victory in Nevada.
Right, and I did think that was interesting, and then when you, I don't know if it's a contrast in the sense, but I guess call it a compare and contrast with just the general question on predicted of which party will control the Senate. Then you get Democrat trading at 52 cents, Republican trading at 50 cents. It's literally just right there is how it seems to me. It's very, it's razor thin close, even when you might see these things trading. And Paul noted last week that predicted, when it has 60 cents or 65 cents or 61 cents or whatever, there's a uh, it's not a super tight correlation between cents, pennies on the dollar, and percentages, but it's not far off. So the numbers are going to add up. They might add up to a little bit more than 100. In the case of the general question, it does. Democrats trading at 52 cents and Republicans trading at 50 cents. But I do think that general question gives a better idea of how close it is. And Paul, maybe you can speak to that as well.
Yeah, it's actually more favourable to the Democrats on Betfair. It's about 57 to 43 for Senate control. You see, my view on that is, if you want to play those markets, then you're better off playing the states, because realistically, I don't see how the Republicans could win the Senate without Nevada, and I don't really see. And also, there are other states further down the line, like Ohio that I mentioned. Some people are making a case for a Democrat upset there. A friend of mine was making a case that that JD Vance is a poor candidate, that Tim Ryan, and I was just saying, maybe that's true, but if you're going to back that, just back the Democrats for the Senate, because there's no way on earth that they're winning Ohio and not winning the Senate. So I'd go for the safer option.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's almost like correlated parlays, huh? If you
Yeah.
if you think something's going to go if you feel a result is going to go one way, there may be other options you can take that will get it to that way without taking the gamble on the option that may not, that is probably less likely to happen.
That is a really good angle to employ with political betting generally. Like when you get a presidential election and the electoral college, we can all tell exactly which states will determine the presidency. So you've had this situation in the last couple of elections where, for example, you couldn't see Trump winning without Pennsylvania, right? So if you were going to back Trump, back Pennsylvania,
Right.
because he could win it and not win because of other states. So there is a lot of correlation between the markets.
Yeah, and Melissa, let me just jump, if I can, real quick. I mentioned correlated parlays, which is probably it's more a sports betting term, but I'll just explain it real quick and then let you we can move on from there. But it's, in a sense, it's if you feel like in a sporting event, if you feel like a game is going to have a certain outcome, there are often prop bets, propositional bets, other bets related to the game that tie into that outcome happening. And you might want to bet both of those, what you think will happen in the game, along with a correlated prop, what might happen in the election, along with a correlated prop. Or you might just want to bet either or, the correlated prop or the overall outcome, depending on where what the odds of the prop and what the overall outcome are, and the likelihood of either happening. You might have a safer bet on one side or the other.
Oh, so that's interesting. So it's sort of, for those who don't engage in betting on the regular, sort of the difference between betting on, if you're at a roulette table and you're betting on, say 5 black, don't at me if that's not what 5 is, but say 5 black, and then also betting on black. Right, because to win one is really to win the other, and you can kind of maximize,
absolutely,
maybe your chances, or even sort of backfill some of your potential losses by betting on sort of black as a color in case your exact number doesn't come back the way you think it will. So, Paul, last week we talked a little bit about the Georgia Senate race and the potential impact of someone like Herschel Walker's scandals, new information, controversy around certain relationships with women and abortions he may or may not have funded. I see here that the Democrats chances of winning, according to Betfair at least, only went up from 60 to 63. And I think that might be because 60 they were already pretty bullish, right? I don't think they were whereas polls were showing more of a toss up. I think the markets were already showing something more favorable for Democrats. Do you think that's why there was such a small jump given the sort of extraordinary new information?
Yes, I think that it was when the scandal broke, it was 50%, and within 24 hours, it was 60%. So there was that instant reaction. I think that was the one state where there was a differential with 538, where the betting was ahead of 538 on the Democrat side. And since then, we've had a few polls that sort of confirm there is some kind of hit on Walker, if not a decisive one. So I think probably that's the right odds now, 63%. I think that would bearing in mind that there is still, as we discussed this, the issue of ticket splitting, because Brian Kemp seems an absolute certainty to win the governorship, so he could carry Walker home.
Well, this race is actually, it reminds me of another Roy Moore. I don't know if you remember him from a few years ago in Alabama. And he was running, and he ended up losing to a Democratic candidate because people just didn't vote for him. It was really, if you look at the districts post-election where Trump had done really well, the drop off in number of people who voted for Roy Moore was not a cliff, but it was enough that he lost the special election for the Senate. And I'm not comparing Herschel Walker to Roy Moore in any sense other than that. But the idea that people just skip that part of the ballot, I think, is real, especially in such a close election like the one we're looking at. That can have real consequences. And this is actually getting to a question, because in Georgia, they have a runoff system. So if you don't get a majority of the votes, you have to have a runoff. And so if you skip the Herschel Walker question, if they skip the Senate question, maybe because you're a Republican who can't really get behind either candidate, that sort of shrinks the pie. And so Warnock has a better chance of winning outright and not go into a runoff. But if you throw your vote to the Libertarian candidate, which at least anecdotally I've heard people are planning to do, then the pie sort of stays the same size, and you might end up in a runoff between Warnock and Walker. And at least traditionally, that favors the Republican candidate. So Walker could still end up having a moment, or having a continued, foot into the race if people throw their votes to the third party candidate. And so my question to you actually is, when you're looking at these odds, and say I bet a certain amount of money that Raphael Warnock is going to win the election in Georgia, is that just this election, or does that not get resolved until a runoff, if there were one?
No, it would be to be elected to the Senate, so it would include the runoff, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
And I would imagine, I would imagine that the majority of the money in that market has not factored that in yet. That's
the potential for runoff.
Yeah, that's a layer of detail that will only strike people on the night if it becomes a factor. Not in all cases, but I'm guessing that is. Remember, we are on another continent, and if there's one thing one thing you do often find with American elections is that we don't understand all the details. As I say, like the whole angle with the Electoral College in presidential elections is a really big constant angle betting wise, because it needs explaining. It's not something we have.
Do either of you want to weigh in on the Democrats going down? Looks like 5 points in Arizona, moving. Still poised to win, according to the odds, but certainly has. That's at 5 points is not insignificant. Does anyone want to weigh in on why you think that might be, or the implications of that?
Well, I'll jump in first, and certainly let Paul roll at it too. But I do, if I recall correctly, in the past week since the time we recorded episode 1 of Get Out the Bet, I believe they had a debate between then and now. I think there was a bump from a bump for the GOP there, or a little bit of a dip for the Democrats in that. I know I've gone back. I went back to this a couple times last week, and I've already mentioned it today. I just have a feeling that for some of this, the economy and some other interesting questions are part of the equation here, are a bigger part of the equation here than perhaps the Democrats would like with the situation the economy's in. Now that may be borne out to not be true. I think it's going to be true in more cases than not, but it could end up being not true in more cases than not. It's definitely going to be true in a lot of cases, one way or the other. It just may not be enough to put to dampen the Democrats' ability to take the Senate, or enough for the Republicans to get a push from it. But I do think it's an issue in Arizona. There are some other issues in Arizona that have come up that have been interesting as well. And this doesn't necessarily tie to the Senate race, but school choice has been a really big battle down there, a really big battle, and it recently resolved very much in favor of proponents of it, of which I'm sure Blake Masters is. And I'm not sure exactly of Mark Kelly's position on that, but generally speaking, I would guess he's not a fan of it in all likelihood. So there are some other issues that have kind of broken over the last couple of weeks, that have broken the GOP's way on things that aren't necessarily on the ballot, but have been they've been hot points for Arizona legislators and Arizona voters, and perhaps that's weighing into it a little bit as well.
Right. I mean, so their voting starts today. Their sort of
Mhm.
absentee or mail ballot voting starts today. Paul, what do you think?
I think that's a plausible explanation, and likewise, I think that the scope for rising gas prices might generally have deterred bettors on the Democrats in general everywhere. Personally, I think that I'm quite confident that Mark Kelly will win that. I think he's a strong incumbent, and I think Blake Masters is a very extreme candidate that will alienate a lot of independents there. And I can't get my head around the fact that the Republicans in Arizona run against the McCains. That's just strikes me as electoral suicide. The McCains were mainstays in that state, very popular people. I mean, okay, if they don't like the McCains, I can understand them be against them, but why publicise it? I don't see where the electoral gain is. That must surely alienate some independents, and that's why I think that I would be in both of those races in Arizona. I'd be more inclined to the Democrats.
Well, I think the key point there is that it's the Republican Party, which is different from Arizona voters. To your point, that the party, always had a bit of an interesting relationship with John McCain. He was the guy who was going to win, but he also wasn't afraid to say no to the party. And so now that he's gone, they can say whatever they always wanted to say about him. But to your point, it may really alienate other voters, independent voters, in just about every state that we're talking about. At least a third of the registered voters are not members of either party. So significant numbers of independents for any race, for any candidate to really have to appeal to wherever they are. And actually, so I want to just take a minute to talk about how betting lines work, like sort of who's setting the lines. I understand some are sort of more stock market looking, as Patrick alluded to, with Predicted and Betfair, versus different kinds of sort of your maybe more traditional, what we think about when we think about gambling, and they're being odds set by the bookmaker. And so I was hoping, Paul, can you weigh in on exactly how that works?
So let's compare this first of all to sports handicapping. So on the one hand, you've got a bookmaker, and that bookmaker will set prices to give themselves a small margin. That will be an individual or a team of people creating those odds, right? And those odds will be based on a combination of data and a particular context of that race. Now, in a sports event, that data is vast and unarguable. If you want to price up total goals for a soccer match, we know what it should be. There's so much evidence out there of the teams involved, the players involved, the average for that league, etc. Right? So perhaps the odds makers would move those odds slightly regarding their own opinion or because they've got a particular liability in the book. But the odds will be fairly predictable and they're not going to stray much between competitors. Now, when you go on a site like Betfair, it is a stock market driven thing. So you've got people like me who would set their own odds and effectively be the bookmaker on that site. Or we might go into it and take the other side and be the gambler because someone else has put up odds and we disagree with them and we think there's a little bit of an angle there. But again, if we were dealing with sports, it would be quite predictable and any margin for error is small. Now with politics, there's the big difference. With politics, you've got very little reliable data to deal with here. You know, there's a constant ongoing argument about the reliability of polls, and even if you are a great advocate of polling, there is still a large margin of error. You've also got historical precedent that we would talk about. But this isn't the same. I mean, if we're talking about how many goals Arsenal will score in a league or the champions of the Premier League will score in a season, that means something. Is the 2024 election, does 2020 and 2016 really apply as a guide to 2024? I'm not so sure. So there's a large amount of variance to how you set those odds. And that's really why one of the reasons that I like political betting. I like to bet on things where there are more variables, where the expert has a bit more of an angle, and politics is a great medium for that. And finally, I'd also just say that the difference with political betting as opposed to sports betting is there's no luck involved. You know, you can have a great bet in a football match based on loads of data and just get unlucky because the goalkeeper has a brilliant match, your team misses 3 penalties, etc. There's no real luck. If I predict that, you know, Joe Biden's going to win the election by 6 million and he doesn't win it, I'm wrong. There's not that isn't a fluke. That isn't a fluke or anything. You don't flukily lose 6 million voters. It would be my assessment is wrong.
And honestly, that's what I love about this, Melissa. And you pointed it out in kind of our pre-show notes. It's just, and I think we even touched on it last week. It's just a situation where, when legislators and so forth make policies, a lot of times they don't suffer any of the ill consequences of those policies. When, poll maker, people who do the polling, I mean, look, as much as you may try to play it straight down the middle or be nonpartisan, even polls, I feel, and, Paul can agree or disagree on this, but even polls to some degree are probably going to have some biases built in. But when you're betting, it's a yes or no thing, and there's a consequence. There's no consequence to being off in your polling, but there is a consequence to being off in either your odds making if you are the bookmaker side, or into making the wager if you are on our side of the counter. And that's, to Paul's point, that's what's fascinating about it, is it settles up, and there aren't just winners and losers in the races themselves, but with political betting, there are winners and losers who try to back their vote, and they're perhaps their vote. I mean, I do know political bettors, and I would guess Paul's probably done this too, where he finds opportunity is maybe bet against, something, an issue or a candidate he supported, but the value was there for the other side, and perhaps he bet it. And I know some people who have done that for sure. They're not necessarily voting in line with betting in line with their voting preference. They're betting in line with where the advantage is. But again, I just like that there's a consequence there. And that's why I kind of like the odds making and betting side of it much more than I like the polling side of it.
Well, it definitely forces people to look across the aisle and see what the virtues are and the value is in candidates maybe you don't even agree with. But to say, I think that other people could, and so the data is showing that this person. So maybe hold your nose and make the bet.
But maybe your bet is counter to your vote.
But it's better than ignoring the other side or pretending that they're the devil, or at least being forced to engage with all the candidates. I think can only be a good thing. And on that note, I want to switch to our next subject, and that is sort of what are people thinking about in this election? I know, Paul, you were interested in what Americans were thinking, if they were thinking at all, about international issues, specifically what's going on in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, considering we are talking about European betting firms, I think it is very important to note that when we talk about American politics, foreign policy dominates. The only things that really compete in our analysis of American politics are maybe guns and abortion, right? Because there's stuff we don't understand. But, we're thinking about foreign policy because our own security is connected to it. We are in NATO. NATO is dominated by the Americans. So whilst, inflation might be the big issue over there, it's not something we're going to talk about much because we're also suffering inflation. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, right now we are living in, to my mind, the most dramatic time of our lives. I think that the world order is really up for grabs. I consider the Ukraine conflict as part of a World War III effectively taking place on multiple levels, on a hybrid level, on a security level, on an economic level. And this is what we're seeing is, it really, to me, it's centre stage in everything that's happening in American politics, right? We see, for example, Elon Musk getting involved with his peace plans for Ukraine and Taiwan and being accused of shilling for them, right? We see big differences in the Republican Party right now. I noticed Mike Pompeo last night coming out strongly for Ukraine, very much, taking a different stance to Trump and Trump's allies. And I know, of course, Trump is on the other side of this to Mitch McConnell and the majority of Republican senators. Now, the question I have is, does this really apply? Because I have a personal, bad experience of this in that 2016, this is an obsession of mine, foreign policy. I can see it through that lens. I couldn't believe that the Republicans would pick Trump, given his stance on Russia, on 9/11, with his association with people like Alex Jones and WikiLeaks, and changing the Republican Party's tickets on Ukraine. And yet it didn't make any difference whatsoever. When Hillary Clinton attacked him for being Putin's puppet, the opinion worm on the poll tracker went down. People didn't want to hear it. So even though we have this point in time, even though everybody's affected by energy prices, that's very much a world issue, very much related to the war in Ukraine. Does this matter? So I want the opinion of two Americans to tell me, how much are people talking about this stuff? Yeah.
Well, Melissa, you want to bring it into focus first? I'll defer to you.
No.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot there. Definitely, and I totally understand where Paul's coming from on this. Especially, if you're in Europe, you're much closer to this conflict than we are, physically speaking. And I think I assume, Paul, there's a sense or look, this is not really that far from our doorstep, even though it's a great distance from Great Britain itself. It's not that far from your doorstep. So you've got to, that's going to compel you to think that way, even in the political betting markets, where foreign policy is going to be much more important to you than what domestic policy is here in the United States. So I totally get that. And it may be enough, foreign policy may be enough to be a driver of who, it may work more in support of Democrats. Because to your point, Paul, there's some differentiation within the Republican Party about what should or should not be going on over there. And as you point out, alluded to Elon Musk and some of these other people coming out and so forth. So totally get that. I just, and I think you're right, Paul, for better or for worse. I'm not saying it's the right thing, but for better or for worse, I just feel like the economy is going to be the bigger driver than foreign policy, even though, to your point, Paul, the economy is in part suffering due to, not necessarily due to foreign policy, but due to what's going on in, over in Ukraine and Russia and elsewhere. So there's an absolute, there's a pretty direct tie there. I'm just, and I know you're surprised by it, and I totally get the surprise, but I'm not sure that they're going to make that. I'm not sure whether voters will make that direct tie and make this more of a foreign policy initiative and a foreign policy ballot issue for how they decide to vote, or whether they'll just be looking at this strictly from the blinders of the United States and what our gas prices are and our energy production and the polling on direction of the country and generic ballots and the economic confidence index. Are they thinking about what's going on elsewhere that's impacting that, or are they just thinking this is a U.S. issue and I'm going to vote on it with the blinders of it strictly being a U.S. issue? I mean, my opinion is the latter, and I'm not saying that that's the proper way to pursue this. I'm not saying it's the improper way to pursue this. I'm saying that voters, are going to vote their interests in the way that they feel those interests line up with whoever, with whichever candidate might pursue those policy interests. But it's definitely fascinating that, again, to your point, Paul, that that foreign policy, as much as it might impact some of the things that we all worry about over here, might be kind of overlooked, I guess, if you will. It seems like that's what you were trying to imply, and I don't deny it.
And also, it's all very unclear, right? It's not like one party's got a hold on pro-Ukraine, anti-Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also not clear that we even know what that means. I mean, are we talking about cutting off all aid? Are we talking about beefing up NATO? Are we talking about invasion? Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know that many Americans have their own personal conviction that is abundantly clear that they can then vote based on that. Right. It's what do we do? What should we do? Elon Musk is going to tweet a plan. Okay, well, everybody give us your best shot here, because it's not clear what the right result is. It's not as simple as saying get out of Vietnam. Right. It's complicated. And so even if people were inclined to look past their immediate needs of sort of gas and food and housing, and then to find a candidate that was aligned with their own personal views about Ukraine, it's not clear that any of that is a knowable line at this point. Again, I love this stuff. I follow this stuff, of course, very interested in it. I'm not totally sure what we should be doing there either. And so certainly, I'm not alone. It's not clear at all that there are like very definitive groups of Americans or groups of politicians who've got a clear proposal about what to do there. And so I think that's part of why it hasn't been, necessarily the at the forefront of what's going on in the debates and what people are listing as their top priority.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't expect
Sorry
it
to disappoint you.
Sorry. No, I didn't expect it to be honest. As I say, I mean, 2016, that was a real shock to me, because previously we'd had like the war on terror, George Bush, Iraq war, which was definitive. It turned around his presidency, right? And a standard attack line at any presidential election is this man or woman capable, fit to take the 3 a.m. phone call, And yet suddenly by 2016, it had just disappeared, right? And it didn't matter. It just didn't seem to matter your stance on NATO. But what has been interesting is that in recent days, Trump's the one ramping this up, if anything. I mean, Trump is talking all the time about Ukraine, right? And Pompeo coming out of a different line yesterday, I mean, thinking ahead, that could have implications for 2024, because I very much took that as a Pompeo's running.
That's interesting.
That I very much took it as a signal.
But I think the party is still grappling with kind of what the line should be. We had Mrs. Adelson come out and say she's setting out the Republican primary this time around, which is serious news about, and shows the sort of uncertainty within what is going to happen. I mean, she gave $100 million last time, and now she's setting out the primary, and I think that shows that they're still grappling with, to what extent they're going to align with either line of thinking. It also seems like things are changing every day, so hard to know what side to even be on sometimes. So I do want to get moving on to our last subject before we head out, and that is the polls versus betting section. We're going to talk about some governor's races. So, Paul, you've taken a look at some of the 538 numbers versus some of the I think it's Betfair numbers, and just for our listeners, Betfair is more of a
Yes.
person to person exchange than a betting line, gambling site. And so those are the numbers we're using from Betfair. And so Paul, run us through what's happening, polls versus betting.
Yep. So I've listed 7 governors races here. Only 3 of them look particularly close, but I think it's worth mentioning all 7. So in Arizona, the betting has Republicans 65% compared to only 51% with 538. In Florida, the Republicans are 91% compared to 94%, 538. That's Ron DeSantis, of course. So implications for the presidential race. Georgia virtually tied, 86% betting versus 87% polls for Brian Kemp. Kansas, this is the interesting one. The betting has it as a 50-50 tie, but 538 have it 66% to the Democrats. And of course, you had that big abortion ballot there recently that went the Liberals' way. So that could be an interesting betting opportunity in Kansas. Michigan, again, very one-sided, 91% to Gretchen Whitmer and the Democrats in the betting, 95%, 538. Nevada, once again, very, very interesting split here. 60% to the Republicans in the betting, 56% to the Democrats on 538. And then finally, probably a one-sided race, New Mexico, 85% Democrats versus 90% on 538.
What do you make of Nevada? It's showing, so betting lines are, Betfair showing 60% likelihood of Carrie Lake winning, and 538 showing 56% chance that the Democrat wins.
My instinct is that Nevada's going Republican. I've thought that during the last 6-7 years of the realignment, Nevada was a state that was more democratically suited to Trumpism than other states. I guess a lot of it's going to evolve around the Latino vote, because the Democrat vote there is entirely reliant, really heavily reliant on that, and the Culinary Workers Union getting their voters out. I'm sceptical they're going to manage that from everything I've read, but obviously there's contrary opinions there, as the betting and the polls suggest.
What about you, Patrick? Do you have any thoughts on why it is there would be such a delta between what the polls are showing versus what the betting is showing?
Right, and to the point I made a little bit earlier, and I think Paul would back me up on this. A lot of time, when you're talking percentages, 60-40, it's not the same as winning an election 60% to 40%, which most people would categorize as a rout, at least, if not a wipeout. But it's definitely interesting here in Nevada. Paul, I think, is no surprise, has hit the nail on the head with this, with how the Latino vote ends up breaking here is probably going to determine who ends up winning this governorship. That factors in, of course, and tangentially and sometimes directly tangentially, kind of the economics of how things rolled out these last couple of years with regard to the economy now, how the state addressed getting through the COVID situation and so forth. I think those are factors that are still, even though we've, generally speaking, put COVID behind us, at least a lot of us have, there's still some, that's still in a lot of people's minds here in Nevada. The economy here just took, I know it took a beating everywhere, but when you're a tourist reliant economy, it's, for better or for worse, it's good. Something like that is just a devastating event that we still haven't really fully recovered from. And I also think with Joe Lombardo, I do feel, from my experience of living here and actually having spoken with Joe Lombardo on multiple occasions in my previous incarnation as the editorial writer at the Review Journal, he's I think he's a pretty affable guy. So I'm not sure that necessarily is a driving factor in all of this, because I don't think people can really get that sense in this kind of race. It's just the commercials where everybody's beating each other over the head with their own sticks, and it's hard to really decipher the actual just quality of the candidate. And I've talked to Steve Sisolak many times too in that role. So I know both these people reasonably well through that. I wouldn't say that they're friendly or anything with them. I just know them well kind of through the process on the opinion page when I was at the RJ. But I can understand the split. I do think it shows that it's a total toss up. I mean, that's how you'd categorize it, right, Paul? This is a total toss up, and and to your point, the Latino vote could decide how that toss up ends.
Yeah, and I'm so sorry, by the way. I said Carrie Lake. I was looking at I was looking
No,
at
it's okay.
Arizona when I talked, so I apologize for that. Yes, it's Lag Lombardo, of course. Okay, well, very interesting. And good note on how Nevada was uniquely affected by COVID, continues to be uniquely affected, by COVID. I think that the GOP has been fairly underrated in Nevada. I'm not sure it's as I mean, I it's obviously a toss up, but I would hesitate for Democrats to get too comfortable there. I still think it's there because of other down ballot races in the very populous counties. I still think it would, it's going to cause a lot of good turnout for a Republican candidate. And so yeah, I think that's what the betting line, the 60% betting line is reflecting there. And actually, to talk about Arizona, the actual race that I was referring to earlier, Paul, what's your take on? You got Arizona, we get 65% on Betfair, 65% chance of a Carrie Lake winning, and then in the polling, 51% chance of her winning. So I mean, both still showing a win, but one obviously a lot more confident in the Republican candidate.
I mean, my view is that it's the contrary to Nevada. In Nevada, I do think that favours the Republicans, and they might be underrated there. Arizona, though, I think is going Democrat. I think Kelly will win, and unless there's a lot of ticket splitting that I don't think will be the case because the Republicans have got two very extreme candidates there, I think that the Democrats will win both there.
Interesting. What about you, Patrick? Do you have any thoughts? I just saw recently there's an editorial I was reading on the Desert News that I guess Katie Hobbs, the Democrat, is refusing to debate Carrie Lake. And that's a strategy that is being used more and more these days among various candidates, but wasn't sure if that's something that voters were cared about or were souring on, or what are the thoughts you had on that?
It might move the needle a little bit. I'm not really sure. Totally not surprised to see it as as a toss up on 538. And relatively speaking, it's a coin toss. With as Paul pointed out on Betfair, that might play into it. But to your point on that, I mean, that's not and as you alluded to, really, it's not unique to one side of the aisle or the other. Just some candidates in there, depending on the position they're in, feel like that's the way to go. I think it probably has a little influence, maybe more so in Arizona. Arizona's, they seem, like I said, I alluded to that school choice thing, and I know that has nothing to do with the Senate or the House or 2024 projections or anything like that, but they're pretty engaged. It's seemingly pretty engaged. So that's it's going to make things perhaps. A debate will make people think, well, look, if she's not even willing to stand on the stage and focus attention on exactly what her policy positions are, maybe that's a tipping point the other direction. But to Paul's point, there are in a lot of circles, people who think Lake and or Masters are extreme right. I don't know if I join Paul in saying extreme, but I understand that that's at least that's the thought of a lot. And that could work very much in Hobbs' favor there, and it could potentially work in Sisolak's favor here in Nevada, among others. It's just so close. I mean, a lot of these are so close, and that's what makes it all the more fascinating when you approach it from the betting and the odds side as opposed from the political polling side.
And Paul, what do you make of this? Before we move on, I just want to get your thought on what do you make of this Kansas result, where it seems like the gamblers are got the race at 50-50, and 538 is showing a pretty confident 66% chance of a Democrat win?
I think that is because it's not particularly newsworthy here. You know, we're not even used. I mean, whereas these other states like Arizona and Nevada, Wisconsin, political gamblers in Europe are used to analysing those states because they're critical states in a presidential election. We've never had anything interesting happen in Kansas ever before. Right? Yeah.
Neither have I.
So we're coming to it late, but I think that the 538 thing is on this extraordinary result in the abortion referendum, right? And that has very much infused the Liberal side, and they expect a big turnout amongst Democrat voters. And I think, look, that's the big thing in this election. It's always the big thing in the midterms, turnout. And it's a known unknown because I'm not sure how much we can rely on history because, look, certainly prior to 2016, the incumbent party was at a massive disadvantage in getting their vote out. We saw that in the results. But then we saw in 2018 a much bigger turnout on both sides, and the polls proven, and that reflected this far more divisive politics, this far more amplified social media war every day. And so particularly in a state where abortion, where one side clearly has the edge on that issue and it's driven turnout, it's driven engagement, I'd be inclined to go with that.
That seems to make sense. Although I'd be curious to see after the election what impact the abortion referendum actually had, in the sense that it might have just neutralized the issue, right? So once you sort of feel confident that you've got this legal protection at the state level, if you're a voter who might have been more concerned about protecting your right to choose, you don't really have to worry about that necessarily, anymore, or at least with regard to this federal election. People might feel like, okay, well, we did that, and now we can vote based on other priorities, and that might not be across the board, but sort of picking that off and sort of handling it in a prior election might have actually deprived some Democrats from a good position to run from. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And with that, we're going to switch to now our final moment, where we're going to talk about our sort of pick of the week, the thing we're talking about, the thing we're thinking about that we just want to share. So quickly, Patrick.
Well,
final thought, pick of the week.
Man, it's just with another 3+ weeks to go on everything that can happen, hard to make a pick of the week. But this is, I just thought, like I said, as I was looking at some polling from, like I said, from Big Data Poll, which is not widely referred to in the United States, but I think it's worthwhile to look at. It doesn't all need to be about 538 or Politico or what have you. I think there are some reputable people doing some interesting things with polling here in the country that sometimes don't register in the mainstream media. And again, I just the economic confidence index level is low, 40% ish in that polling. The generic ballot is like dead even. I mean, a complete toss up, and that's just a generic ballot of who wins what, House and Senate and so forth. There's it's very, very close, which makes for a really fun next 4 weeks, as there are 3.5-4 weeks as this all unfolds heading into November. I think that the right direction, wrong track polling is interesting. Again, this sways from the odds sometimes, but it gives a sense of what voters are thinking, and if they feel like on a right direction, wrong track poll, if that's running 65-25 in favor of wrong track, to me, I feel like there could potentially be some correction and correlation with how the votes go come that first week of November, first full week of November. So but polling, as we pointed out, is not always, as often can be very accurate. It often can be off by quite a bit. So some people are either going to be proven very, very wrong or very right in this. And again, that's why I like the betting part of it. I'll throw something out there that will make Paul money, because I know Paul's more correct on this than I am. He is the expert on the actual betting of politics because he's done it for so long. But I'm going to go on a limb and say the GOP gets 2 of 3 between Nevada, Georgia, Pennsylvania. That's what I'm going to say. I feel like that's on a limb because I know Paul knows his stuff, and I know he's putting his money where that action is in some form or fashion, like he alluded to last week. That 50, 51, or 52 seats. I think that's a great bet, Paul. It's an excellent bet. So he's done this, but I'm going to go on a limb and say that, and we'll see how things unfold over the next 3 weeks and how much better should be fading my opinion for sure.
Paul, rebuttal.
Okay, well, no.
Or support,
No, I think that they are the 3 states. No question in my mind. They're the 3 states. And I personally think that the Democrats will win 2 and the Republicans will win 1. The Republicans will win Nevada, and I think the Democrats will win Georgia because of Herschel Walker. Although you raise a very good point about this runoff situation that might yet be a spanner in the works. But Pennsylvania, I'm actually very confident about for the Democrats. And I think in that case I think there's a lot of partisan bias in the coverage. I think I've seen a lot of fake videos, doctored videos being sent out about Fetterman, and okay, maybe some of that stuff works, but I'm not really convinced. And it's notable that even the pollsters that factor in shy Trump voters, like Trafalgar, they have Fetterman ahead, right? So Absolutely. We're talking about a major miss there, if that's wrong. And I also just think that Dr. Oz is another terrible candidate. I think I'm not saying the Republicans couldn't win that race, but he's a poor candidate. And he only just won the primary despite Trump's support in a very Trumpy state, He's a carpetbagger from New Hampshire, right? He's got so much scandal around him, it's unbelievable, right? And it's a gift to Fetterman. And I think that at what are quite lengthening odds, he's a really good bet now, Fetterman.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how the celebrity candidates, I don't want to say fad, but what we're seeing a lot recently with celebrity candidates. Even I would even put J.D. Vance in Ohio in that bucket as well. But also Dr. Oz, also Herschel Walker. If these candidates aren't able to ultimately win, even though they've got name recognition and maybe really positive associations with them, at least initially, then maybe you might you'll see the party sort of backing away from those kind of folks in the future. There just might be too much downside. I'll finish it out by just letting you know, I, in a very nonpartisan way, hate the 2-party system. And so I am thrilled at the Oregon governor's race. That's just one to keep an eye on. It's very interesting. In Oregon, there is an independent. She's a Democrat turned independent who has raised a ton of money, including from folks like Steve Knight of Nike up there. And she is running basically sort of to the right of the Democrat and to the left of the Republican candidate. And she hasn't polled for more than, say, 15 to 20%, but she's definitely preventing the Democrat from getting a majority. Now they don't have a runoff system. Whoever gets the plurality wins, but she's really, I think, showing, Tina Kotek is her name. And I think she's showing and really stands out there for anyone who, like me, who is really just thrilled to see folks who are neither Democrat nor Republican, but really appealing to a set of people who may feel alienated from the process otherwise. So she's doing really well. Again, well enough to kind of throw a wrench into the race. Probably not well enough to win so far, but is actually making a footprint. I think sending an important message to the parties about how alienated some people feel. So I'm enjoying watching that. That is the Oregon governor's race. So maybe keep an eye out on that one as you're flipping through the channels. All right, gentlemen, I believe that is our show for the week. Thanks everyone for listening. Don't forget to send us your questions at an address we will put in the show notes. And as a reminder, betting on politics is not permitted in the U.S. It's only permitted in some places in Europe. This podcast is for informational purposes only. We encourage any gamblers out there to check out a variety of sources. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.